So hello, all of you online and those who are here. I'm Doug Jones, President of the Vancouver Island Chapter 19 of CARP. I welcome you to this hybrid meeting of the chapter. Those who are present in this wonderful pavilion, Esquimalt Gorge Park Pavilion, and those who are listening simultaneously on the broadcast, and those who will be watching later on the recording. I'll remind those who are watching simultaneously, though, to please mute your microphone as we go through. And I want to acknowledge, I have to get my little controller because my other controller is not working. So the other component, of course, is that we have a vast array of people who are part of the membership here. And so we need to acknowledge the fact and respect the many First Nations of Vancouver Island and the Canadian Gulf Islands of the Salish Sea, on whose traditional territory CARP Vancouver Island Chapter 19 operates, and their peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Just a few housekeeping items here. If you would put your name in the chat and where you're located from, that would help us very much. Remember to ask your questions at the end and give the other person a chance to answer first of all. And I would also say, try to keep your questions brief so we have time for other questions. But don't be inhibited in any way at all. It is being recorded. The recording will be available about a week after this recording is taken. And we will stop the formal part of the meeting at 3 o'clock. So that's where we're going from here. So, we passed one of yours somehow. We missed this one. So it's my pleasure to introduce Gordon Reese, Associate Director of Applied Science Solutions of Ocean Networks Canada, who's going to provide information on earthquake early warning and tsunami alert. And with the recent catastrophic earthquakes that have been around the world, I'm sure that nobody here is surprised with our location on a major tectonic plate with expectations of, quote, the big one coming, that this audience would be very interested in this information. So please join me in welcoming Gordon.
All right, thanks to the CARP and Doug especially for the invitation here. Really appreciate it, and I hope you find the presentation interesting. As he stated, it's going to be generally about earthquakes, tsunamis, and general mayhem. So yeah, we've already done the acknowledgement, so I'm just going to skip over this. And I'm going to give you just a bit of background about ONC, Ocean Networks Canada, so it gives you some context of what I'm going to be presenting on, as well as our operations. So once we get through that, you'll be better positioned to understand how earthquake early warning and our tsunami detection and modeling systems actually work. So Ocean Networks Canada is a not-for-profit society established in 2007. We're managed under the University of Victoria. And we're actually one of Canada's largest major science initiatives. So these are research facilities of national importance. So to date, there's been about 500 million that's been invested in our infrastructure, and it's considered world leading for what it's doing. We have about 160 employees right now, mostly located just off campus, off Arbutus Road, but we also have a facility out by the airport where we do all our major engineering type work. All right, hopefully you can see this this screen. Doug, can I borrow your laser pointer too, just for the people in the view?
Red dot.
Red dot. All right. So we have infrastructure in Canada that covers all three coasts. So we have on the west coast here, we have infrastructure going all the way up to Prince Rupert in all our community observatories. We have cabled arrays off the coast here and in the Salish Sea, which I'll talk about in more detail later. We also have a footprint, growing footprint up in the Arctic. So we've been in Cambridge Bay for quite some time, but we also have been working in a location further north here that you can't quite see called Gascoyne Inlet. And we also on the East Coast have much more of an emerging footprint as well. So we have different radar systems and autonomous buoys there. And within the next few months, we're actually going to be installing some small infrastructure in Antarctica with some of our Spanish partners as well. So we'll be collecting data from there at some point as well. So the whole purpose of all this infrastructure is to collect critical data about the oceans so that we can actually get a deeper understanding of their processes and how it works. It's such a critical aspect that affects all facets of life, as you know.
Can you see?
Yeah.
Sorry, was there a comment? No. All right, so on the south coast of BC here, which is where our major infrastructure is currently located, we have these things called cabled arrays or networks, which I'll be talking quite a bit about. So we have one over here off the Lower Mainland, which you can see on this inset called Venus. And it is actually a cable network that goes about 44 kilometers coming out from the Vancouver airport, extending down to about Roberts Bank. And then we also have one off the west coast, which is a 900-kilometer loop terminating in Port Alberni. And these cabled arrays or networks, if you will, are essentially allow for continuous power and communications to be supplied subsea. So historically, the way oceanographic research worked was people had to scrape together money to go get a particular vessel. They would go out to their location of interest. They would drop their instrument over the side of the boat, collect a point measurement, collect their data, and that's how the research was done. So the problem with that, obviously, is you're only looking at a single point in time in a single location. So you're ignoring the tidal cycles that were happening daily. You're ignoring the seasonal variations that happen across years, let alone things that happen over decades. So by now, supplying power and communications under the sea, we can collect data in high resolution in real time continuously. So you build up these long time series worth of data that allow researchers to really explore what's happening for whatever processes that they're looking at. So Venus was actually the first observatory of its type. It was quite groundbreaking at the time, and it was designed by a visionary researcher at the University of Victoria named Verena Tunnicliffe in collaboration with one of her partners from University of Washington, John Delaney. So they established that network in 2006, and this is actually studying a lot of the processes that are coming in off of the Fraser Delta. Neptune followed a couple of years later, and it was a major undertaking, as you can see. And the location was actually decided upon by an international scientific group. And the reason why they chose this location is within this one small area, you could basically study all of the ocean processes. So let's just give 1 sec here to get our image back. There we go. In this one location, we can study the shallower coastal areas coming out across the continental shelf, across this subduction zone, which is where two tectonic plates are actually are meeting, going across the abyssal plains and then out towards a spreading ridge. So this spreading ridge is actually where new land essentially is being created, new subsea land. So all the activity here is creating new land, and it's spreading out. And this plate here, the Juan de Fuca plate, is being pushed towards the North American plate. And that's where you get this subduction zone here that we'll be talking about in more detail. All right. All right, so the back end of this is all this infrastructure is the data. So we're actually, as you can see, we have an enormous amount of sensors, not all scientific. A lot of them are engineering, monitoring the infrastructure as well. We currently have collected over 1 petabyte of sensor data. I think it's actually close to 1.5. And a petabyte is like 1 million gigabytes. This is the equivalent of, I think if you were to start watching video 24/7, it would take you about 4 years maybe to watch it all. And we're actually collecting about 300 gigabytes every day of data that's just streaming in from all those different locations. A lot of that is acoustic data. So being in the ocean, the primary method of measuring things, because it's very hard to see things, and it's very deep and very big, obviously, is through acoustics. So that's both passive acoustics, listening for things with hydrophones, but also active where we're injecting, noise into the environment to detect other things such as whales and things. So all this data, by the way, is freely available to the public. So we make it accessible through our data portal called Oceans 3, which is available on our website. So if you're interested in checking that out, you just have to go to oceannetwork.ca and look for Oceans 3. Okay, so this is just a representation of all these different locations streaming into Oceans 3 that I was just talking about from all the different locations. So again, that's all happening in real time as we speak. And what do we do with all this data? So the networks, while it's the fundamental purpose, if you will, is for science and enhancing science, part of our vision is to actually give back to society and industry by providing whatever solutions we can that would be helpful. So some of the ones that we see here are, we'll be talking about today, like earthquake early warning, tsunami detection. We also have marine domain awareness, so being able to display what the sea state conditions are actually doing. Being able to monitor surface currents. So this allows for oil spill response to find out about where that oil might be drifting to, or search and rescue operations. Vessel tracking and tracking of whales so that we can avoid those collisions. All right, so that's the high level overview. Now I just want to talk a bit about the actual infrastructure itself that I've been talking about. So this is the primary infrastructure. So on the left-hand side here, you see the basic cables that I've been talking about. And so this is standard telecom cable. So there's many different types, but they all have these power conductors, which is this copper band near the top. And then at the very top, these are strands of fiber for communications in the very center of it. All the remaining part, all the bottom part that you see there in black, those are steel bands that are actually providing armoring to help protect the cables. There's many different types of aggression that these cables can go through. Predominantly, our biggest threat is fishing boats and trawlers that can go down to 1,000 meters. They can just wreak havoc on all this infrastructure. Ship anchors and other things, or just natural processes, the chafing of it based on the currents, etc. So it's very specialized cable, and there's various types just depending on where you are. Interestingly enough, the deeper you go, the less aggression. So the lighter cabling you can get away with, cheaper it is, and also, less armoring. So that cable supplies the power and communications, and it takes it to these things called nodes, which are shown here on the right. So these are the big blocks that are designed to actually distribute the power. So this is typically high voltage that's being put through the cables. At the nodes, it steps it down and allows it to be more usable. And we have different ports on these nodes that allow for the spider webbing out of all these instruments and platforms across the seafloor. So we'll have nodes established every so often along our cables. So the instrument platforms I'm talking about are showing here on the right. So this would be a connection. You can see this cable, which will be going up to the node, getting its power and communications. And on these platforms, there'll be various types of instruments. And there can be many that can be supported on here. The electronics that are used, like on the bottom left, is actually kind of like a multiplexer. So the power and communications will come in, and we'll be able to support up to like 10 different instruments off this one device, as well as daisy chain it to another platform where we might have another device and support another 10. So this again allows us to do this spider webbing. The installation of it is quite complex, and it requires specialized vessels. So in this picture here at the top, this is a cable laying vessel. It's called the Cable Innovator, and you might recall this vessel actually had its home port in Victoria for a number of years. It actually is under contract with the major telecom providers to handle any sort of telecom issues that might happen right across the Pacific. And it's really conveniently located for us, so it's been able to do a lot of our cable lays and maintenance and repairs. The vessel at the bottom is a research ship. This is actually from OET, Bob Ballard's vessel. He was the guy who discovered the Titanic, but we contract with him to come and help us with our instrument placements. And on the back of the boat there, it's a little hard to see, but that little yellow vehicle is a remotely operated vehicle. It'll get lowered down and it'll actually fly around near the bottom and do all our instrument connections and whatever needs to be done. Typically, we're not using research vessels like this. We contract with the Canadian Coast Guard. So the Tully, the vessel that's here, is the one that we primarily use for our offshore and inshore work. Okay, so what does this all look like? This is a cartoon representation of the infrastructure. So you can see this is our shore station, and that's that black line coming down is the power and communications cable. You see how it's connected to the nodes at various locations. And from the nodes, you have that spider webbing out to all the instrument platforms. And here we can actually see one of the daisy chains out. So in this way, we're able to support all those 9,000 sensors that you see. So there's an incredible amount of instrumentation that we have out there. And it's not just
if you use the mouse arrow online, you can see it.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Right, apologize for that to everybody online. So this instrumentation, by the way, is not just on the seabed, but we actually have instrument and boreholes that go beneath the seafloor, on the seafloor, obviously, in the water column. So we have instrumentation that profile up and down, as well as autonomous vehicles that'll glide through the water, carrying different instrument payloads. We have surface systems, like some of the BC ferries actually have some of our instruments, so their daily crossings are actually collecting water property data for us. We also have radar systems as well, both on this coast and on the East Coast, looking for, you'll see that as part of the tsunami detection, but also for surface currents. All right, and these are just other depictions of what that instrumentation actually looks like. This image on the top left is actually an actual depiction of one of our installations. It's called Folger Pinnacle at the top here and Folger Deep. So our teams use diagrams like these and other drawings to help them with their dive planning, but just to visualize where everything is and help plan the missions. Okay, let's get into earthquake early warning. So the earthquake early warning system is based on all that infrastructure that you've just seen, and I'll be able to show you in a bit more detail. So just a little bit about the program. We started back in about 2014, so nearly 10 years ago, with trying to develop a solution that would leverage this infrastructure and some of the sensors that we had. So we received some level of funding from the government, and as you can see, it was a little bit sporadic through the years, given the government funding vagrancies and things. But we're actually at a point now where our system is actually been proven out and we've commissioned it. Last year we had an international peer review committee from scientists from the US Geological Service, from NRCan here, and other scientific experts just validating the operation of our system. And to date, it's been about nearly 12 million that's been provided through various agencies. One of the largest ones being Emergency Management BC. So just before we talk about the earthquake early warning, we need to understand just a little bit about earthquakes. So what I'm showing you here is a depiction of the Pacific Rim of Fire. So this is about 40,000 kilometers long. We're obviously situated up in this area, right up in here. I had some stats here for it. I'm just going to refer to it. So yes, so about 2/3 of the world's volcanoes are actually located along this ring of fire. 90% of the world's earthquakes happen in this area, and over 80% of the largest ones happen. So we have the misfortune of being located where we are, which is up in here. Now this little line here is showing you the boundary of the Juan de Fuca plate that we'll be talking about. So right along here is a zone called the Cascadia Subduction Zone, which is right off our coast. And the other one of interest that I'll be talking about is the Alaska Aleutian one up here. And they've both been responsible for the historical major earthquakes and tsunamis that we've had on our coast here.
So it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so what does that look like with these plates? So this is the Juan de Fuca plate that I was showing you. This is the Cascadia subduction zone, and that's actually 1,000 kilometers long. It goes from the northern end of Vancouver Island all the way down to California.
Well, we're leaving.
In the subduction zone, what's happening is this plate is being pushed up against the North America plate. And rather than sliding gently underneath, what's happening is that they're actually locked and they're stuck. And so the pressure is mounting. And what's going to happen, and it has happened in the past, is that that pressure will be released and it'll flip up. And when it flips up, that's what's going to cause the major displacement of the water, which causes the tsunamis. A lot of other earthquakes that happen, depending on the relative plate motions, will happen side to side, and they'll cause maybe major shaking and things, but not the tsunami effects. So within the Cascadia zone, though, it will be this, what they call a mega thrust earthquake. So that lifting up when it happens. So the last major event actually happened on January 26, 1700. And they know this for two different reasons. Number one was traditional knowledge from the First Nations living here and their oral stories, but it was actually recorded in writing in Japan, which had some major devastating effects to them, the resulting tsunami from it. So based on all the information at the time and the geological history, they were able to piece back exactly what had happened. So that was, just over 300 years ago. And so, the period of return, because there's been about 6 or 7 in the last 3 or so thousand years, is 400 approximately years. So at some point in the not too distant future, maybe within the next 100 years, we can expect one to be happening again. Let's hope that it's 100 years from now and not tomorrow.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Number one, do you mind if we take a picture of the slide?
No, absolutely not.
And number two, you may get to it, but for people like myself that live on the eastern side of the island,
Mhm.
is the tsunami going to be as much of an issue? Like, is that water going to rip around and,
Typically not, and I'll show you a little bit about that further on. Yeah, but it's definitely more protected.
You finish watching it? Looks like it's getting good.
Okay, so how do we actually detect earthquakes? So when an event actually happens, let's say the earthquake is centered at this particular spot, there's different types of waves that emanate out from it. So there's something called the P wave, an S wave, and some surface waves. This P wave is the initial sort of shock wave that gets sent out, and it travels about approximately 7 kilometers a second, depending on the type of material that it's moving through. But that's generally the speed that it's going. The damaging waves, the real shaking waves, are called the S waves, and they're much slower. So moving through soft sediments, they can be as slow as maybe 1 kilometer a second, or through solid rock, maybe up to 4 kilometers a second. So the P waves are really on average traveling, let's say, about twice as fast as these S waves. So the whole theory behind earthquake early warning is if you can detect the P wave first, right? This is the non-damaging wave, then you will have a heads up notice of what's coming in behind it. And the properties of the P wave allow, they've developed algorithms to be able to determine what the likely shaking is going to be based on the properties of that P wave. So the whole earthquake early warning really boils down is to be able to sense that initial P wave, calculate what that shaking wave is going to look like, compute when we can expect to feel that shaking, and then communicate out alerts, so that hopefully we have X amount of time of warning. So the system that we developed is actually defined to be, this is its detection monitoring area, if you will. So we're only looking for earthquakes that might emanate within this zone, which really covers the majority of the part of the Cascadia subduction zone that we're interested in. So this is approximately about 600 kilometers by about 700 kilometers. So it's pretty sizable. And the system itself it's been designed to really only reliably detect earthquakes from about magnitude 4 and up. So that's magnitude 4 is usually not even felt by people, but it's the threshold of where we're confident we can actually detect and classify the earthquakes for it. And here, this diagram is showing, so again, here's Neptune, cabled array going over the subduction zone. And this is showing all the different sensors. So these are seismometers that we have in place for the detection specifically of that P wave. So we have about 8 of the sensors offshore. So actually located as close as we can to the subduction zone to give us the maximum amount of warning time. Oops, sorry. As well as we have all these land-based ones as well on Vancouver Island. So there's just over, there's about 44 of these land-based sensors. And what do these sensors look like? So on the subsea ones, this is the left here is a good shot of the seismometer that we use. So we take those down again with that ROV, that remotely controlled vehicle that I've shown you before. We dig a hole in the seafloor and put a caisson in there. This seismometer gets lowered into it. And then we fill up the caisson and surrounding the instrument with glass beads. So this couples the actual seismometer to the surrounding environment. And it's a very effective way of still being able to communicate the S waves from the surrounding environment into the instrument. The sensors on land look like this. So we have, they're typically solar powered because a lot of them are on mountaintops. We need clear visibility of the sky for communications. A lot of them are using systems like Starlink or Cell to actually communicate the data. So this involves a lot of sort of helicopter trips for our engineering team to some pretty remote locations. Okay, so this is depicting the importance of having sensors offshore, and currently we're the only place in North America that's got offshore sensors like this close to the subduction zone. The Japanese are obviously very concerned about the offshore, like with the Tohoku 2011 event that they have. So they have a fairly dense array of these sensors as well. But this is showing a simulation of, if we had an earthquake source at either of these locations, the extra amount of time of warning that could be produced as opposed to just land-based sensors themselves. So by having these offshore sensors, we can gain at least another 15 seconds on average of warning time. And the key design elements of this are, by placing these sensors as close to the fault zone as possible, we can maximize the alert times. We try and do as much of the processing of the data. There's a lot of computation that has to go when one of these instruments actually detects an event. Like, is it an actual earthquake? Did other sensors detect it or not? We need a minimum of 4 sensors to actually be able to reliably declare that it was an earthquake. And then to be able to characterize it, it's very computationally complex. So we try and do as much of that as close to the instrument as possible. So we're minimizing the amount of data that has to flow back to our central location to make sense of it all and to ultimately issue the alert. One of the things I should have mentioned too, on the land-based ones that I showed, they actually use, it's not just the seismometer, they also use a GNSS sensor, which is essentially GPS, like we use for our navigation. So when you have an earthquake greater than a 6 magnitude, the sensors themselves cannot determine anything reliably above a 6. They're not quite sure if it's a 6 or a 7 or whatever because of the volume of the shaking. But with the GPS sensor attached to it as well, they can actually accurately qualify these earthquakes up to the very large scales. Fortunately, we can't use those subsea because we can't get the satellite signals at that particular depth. So, and those sensors that are out here, can be up to 2,000 meters deep off Neptune. Okay, and the key value obviously is saving lives and protecting the infrastructure. So these are just a few of the potential uses: slowing down trains, shutting off major gas valves, preventing landings and takeoffs of airplanes, stabilizing surgeries that might be in progress. There's a multitude of different issues. This is where seconds count. So, we've detected so far with our system over 110 earthquakes, and the maximum amount of alert time that we would have been able to provide to Vancouver was 71 seconds. So, which is pretty sizable when you actually, have over a minute of time. But a lot of these earthquakes, and depending on where they are, how close they are, we might not have very many seconds at all. So it's not much time for humans, but automating the alerts for some of these critical infrastructure operators to have a machine actually receive the alert that might be sent out and actually take action autonomously is where we want to see a lot of the value here. So shut down those valves to stop the trains, the airlines, etc. ProTrains, which operates the Canada line for the SkyTrain, is actually one of our partners and has one of the seismometers on their location and is currently receiving our alerts and trialing it out for us. Okay, that's the earthquake part of it. I'm just going to shift gears now into the tsunami, so the other side of the coin as well. So we have two different services solutions that we provide through Ocean Networks Canada. First one I'm going to talk about is the inundation modeling. So we have a team who actually simulates the events of a major megathrust earthquake off Cascadia or in the Aleutians, and simulate what that'll happen to individual communities up and down the coast for their unique location. So again, the major sources for tsunamis are earthquakes. That's by far the largest source of them. But there are a number of other sources as well that we don't usually think of. The next biggest one is landslides, which have been a major problem for our coast. There's been a lot of activity here in the Strait of Georgia with different landslides, subsea landslides, which have caused destructive damage. Up the coast, Hartley Bay, so this is in the Kitimat area, a lot of historical evidence of major tsunamis created by these subsea landslides. As recently as 1975 in Kitimat, they had a landslide, subaerial one, which caused, I think it was up to six meter waves that caused a bunch of destruction. And that was actually from construction activity, which caused the landslide. The other one here, Lituya Bay. If you don't know about Lituya Bay, that's an interesting one to Google as well. That's the largest reported mega tsunami, which was caused by a landslide. So the landslide was triggered by an earthquake in Kodiak. It was close to a magnitude 9. But in Lituya Bay, the landslide triggered 30 million cubic meters of rock to come down into the bay, about 90 million tons. And the resulting wave went up as high as over 500 meters. So on the hillside, it was over 1,700 feet and cleared the forests, etc. Luckily, it was in a remote area, but there was still commercial fishermen who were anchored in the bay and things. And unfortunately, there was 5 people who lost their lives. But it was a devastating event, but a very good example of the damage that landslides can cause. Subsea volcanoes is another source. So you might recall nearly a year ago, there was an event in Tonga. So a subsea volcano erupted. It was a major eruption, probably second only to the Krakatoa event a few hundred years ago. The eruption itself, Tonga is about 9,000 kilometers away, but we picked it up on our seismic sensors here. We also were able to detect this resulting tsunami wave. So the remnants of that came up to our shores, it was only, I think, 10 or 15 centimeters by the time we got here, but we were able to detect it. It actually created a shock wave that went around the world 3 times. And the barometers on MET stations were able to pick that up as it kept traversing around the globe. And the last one is atmosphere. So storm systems can actually cause destructive tsunami-like waves. So we have evidence of that in Tofino, which I'll show you in a moment as well. This other image here is obviously just showing, this is from the Tohoku event. So this was based on the earthquake, but obviously very devastating tsunami. And again, just showing you, the subduction zone of the plates going underneath and the lifting up that displacement of the water. So the mechanics of that, again, is when you have that flipping up that we're expecting, the megathrust, you're going to displace all this water, which actually travels out in all directions. So that water, as it's oscillating towards the shore, is going to usually result in a drawback in the water too. That's why a lot of the people who've witnessed tsunamis have reported seeing the water actually disappear out of the bay because it's being sucked down as the wave is approaching the shore. And then as the wave approaches the shore, it starts interacting more with the actual bathymetry, right? So as it gets shallower, that wave has got a lot of energy, but it's having to slow down because it's hitting up against the actual seafloor, so it tends to rise up. So that kinetic energy is being pushed up into potential as it's coming to hit the shore. So offshore, that might be quite a small wave that's approaching, but as it gets closer to the shore, that's when it's going to start to grow. So our modeling that we do actually incorporates three main elements. So the first one is the source. So we have to pick what is the source that we're trying to model for. And typically that's a seismic source because we're concerned mostly about these megathrust type earthquakes. So that's where the Cascadia event or subduction zone is one of our main sources, but also the Alaska Aleutian one here. The second part is we have to have a very detailed understanding of what that looks like, the actual bathymetry and topography of the land as the wave is approaching the shore, because that's going to dictate exactly how it's going to interact with our coastline. So we do that by creating these digital elevation models. There's a little thumbnail here just showing you that sort of detailed look of what it looks like down below the water, as well as important to know what's it like above the land, because that's going to dictate how far the water is going to inundate on shore. And then bringing it all together is sophisticated modeling software, which will actually simulate the wave propagation, allow us to determine those inundation levels, but also the velocity levels of the water as well. And this software we have to run on supercomputers that we have access to, and it can take days for these simulations to run. And so there's a lot of work that goes into the source and the digital elevation models to make sure that all that running of the software is seamless, because it drives our team crazy when they discover a little bug or something they need to tweak after 4 or 5 days of it running, and it sets them back. So we talked about the seismic sources. I won't talk about that, but I will show you more about the DEMs that we create. So basically, these digital elevation models rely on a lot of very high resolution data that's collected either from acoustic measurements. So ships will go out and use echo sounders to actually determine what the bottom looks like. And also fly LiDAR, which is like laser lights coming down that they mount in airplanes, which will detect, what the topography looks like, but can actually penetrate the water a bit as well. So we collect data wherever we can. It's usually a very labor intensive job to create these DEMs because the data is of questionable quality at times in different formats using different datums. It can be a real mess. So the teams have their job cut out for them to create these models. The biggest one we've done is this one in the Salish Sea. And this was actually brought together 30 organizations, and we used 3 terabytes of data to create the highest resolution model of the Salish Sea that's ever been created. So we use this for some modeling up in the Boundary Bay area, simulating different earthquakes. Here's another one just showing northern Vancouver Island. So you can see the land, the shelf here, and dropping off down towards this subduction zone. This one on the bottom left is actually a representation of Port Alberni. So this is the Alberni Inlet coming up, and Port Alberni is up at the head. And then the wave propagation. So the results of the model, this modeling software, will actually show us what that wave will actually do with the coast. So these are little snapshots from a simulation. This one on the left is from a Cascadia subduction zone, magnitude 9 event. And you can see how that wave is propagating right across the ocean, as well as obviously having significant impacts on shore, which I'll show you a little bit more of here too. This is one from the Alaska Aleutian subduction zone, which has been responsible for the 1964 Port Alberni tsunami, if you might recall that. That was based on a more distant earthquake and resultant tsunami.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So let's take Kitimat, for example. So if a tsunami is moving up an inlet and then possibly a river, is that narrowing of does it help dissipate the waves or does it help maximize the waves?
It concentrates it.
Yeah, okay.
And I say usually because it really depends on the unique, bathymetry and topography of the area. So some effects, like when you think of the Bay of Fundy, they have massive tides in there every day, but that's because of a resonance effect. So the actual wavelength of the waves going in, they build on each other. So by the time it gets in closer, that's why they have that huge highs and lows. Whereas, not too far distance away, they don't get that experience. So there's different effects with the bathymetry, the topography of it, with resonance factors, all these sort of things. So
Tides at the moment, but they're high or low.
absolutely.
Yeah.
If it's a high tide, you need to account for things like storm surges or sea level rise. These are all factors that have to come into play. Great question. This is a simulation showing you the effects in the region. So this is up in Nootka Sound and Esperanza Inlet. So up on the west coast, sort of mid coast. It's a time lapse. So it's going to show you over 6 hours what that inundation actually looks like. So the darker colors are, a negative level, if you will, below the average sea level at the time. Whereas the more red ones are showing you the height of it above the average. And you're going to notice as you watch it, a lot of the sloshing effect as the colors change. And, people think of tsunami as just a wave, maybe two, but it's really not. It can be multiple and it can go on for a long period of time. Just the in and out. It's like sloshing in the bathtub. And it's not just the height of the water, but this is a massive amount of water going in and out. It's also the velocities, especially in the narrowing constrictions. So that's one of the other major damaging effects. It's not just the height of the water and how far it's going in, but it's how fast that it's actually moving. So we're at 4 hours and you can still see the effects are pretty significant. This simulation actually stops at the 6 hour mark, but it can go on for quite a significant period of time. These simulations that we did were for the Strathcona Regional District and a lot of the communities up the coast. And all the maps and simulations can be found online if you go to the Strathcona Regional District and interested in checking those out. So one of the maps, so this is for Cassis, up the mid-coast, shows you the water inundation level. So this is an inundation map. So this blue area that you see is where the water would reach to. And here's the actual river. All this area under here, this is all residential areas. You can see the houses, etc. So it shows you the extent of where the water would actually get to. The darker blue is just a safety factor that's been added onto it. So really, for planning purposes, the town planners would be looking at the extent of all the blue. So you can see, like these areas would be completely cut off from the rest of the town. These major roads are all going to be submerged. So by providing this level of information for communities, they can start to prepare and say, where is our critical infrastructure? How are we going to plan? How will we respond? And, for places like Cassis, obviously, this is a significant type of scenario. So that was an inundation map. This is actually a velocity map. So this is the other part that I was talking about, was it's not just the height of the water, but it's the speed that it's moving. So these darker colors that you see are actually at 9 knots or greater, which if you're a boater, you'll know that that's a really fast moving water. And it's not just the speed of the water, but with the inundation and the height, there's going to be a lot of debris in the water too. It's going to be picking logs off the beaches and moving around. So you can imagine what a log moving at 9 knots, might do to a marina or boats or other infrastructure. So the velocities are a critical component as well that'll help with the planning. Okay, so that's the modeling of predicting what it might look like, but what about the actual detection of tsunamis? So we actually have, 2 different ways of doing that. One is on the surface and the other subsurface. So on the surface, we actually have a radar installation near Tofino called a WIRA system. And this radar can actually look out about 80 kilometers offshore and detect incoming waves. That's the purpose of it. So I think this was 2016, it actually detected our first tsunami. And this was a very small one. It was a medio tsunami. So this was caused by one of those storm systems that I was talking about. So the actual pressure of the storm systems pushing down and up with a high and low can actually cause these waves to form. And over here on the right, this red area is showing this actual detected tsunami. It was only about 20 centimeters high, so very, very small, but it proved the technology out. It was able to determine that, no, this is not a normal tidal flow of water, that this is an actual, independent body of water moving towards shore. Had this been an actual, impactful type tsunami, we would have been able to have given the community about 20 minutes worth of warning time. So not insignificant. The other way of measuring, detecting, I should say, tsunamis is using instruments like you see on the bottom left here. This is called a bottom pressure recorder. And this is how they measure actual height of the water, is through the pressure that water creates. And these instruments are incredibly sensitive. So in 5,000 meters of water, these instruments can detect a change in the water level less than a millimeter. So which is just astounding to me. And by using the software to actually remove any of the normal tidal cycle properties, they can also detect tsunami waves. So again, we have these BPRs, bottom pressure recorders, installed at various locations on the Neptune array. And after the Tonga event last year, we were able to track the tsunami, the remnants of the tsunami as it crossed our network. So these are the times showing of when it was detected. And over here on the plots, you can actually see the signals, clear signals that are forming. So this particular wave, I think, was 10 to 15 centimeters. So again, very small, but it just shows you the sensitivity of the instruments to be able to detect it. So the data from these systems are used by the National Tsunami Warning Center, which is NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, a US agency. So they monitor and detect tsunamis for BC and the US. So all our alerts come from the National Tsunami Warning Center, which we feed into. And the second method is also using these buoys. So NOAA also operates these dart buoys, they're called, which again there's a string of them. You can see on this lower right image. They go around the Aleutians and then down our coast here. And essentially all it is a BPR attached to a buoy, which then will communicate via satellite. So they have these very far offshore. So they won't be any use to us for detecting a locally created tsunami from an earthquake because they're too far away. By the time they detect it, we're probably already going to be feeling the effects of it. But they can detect tsunamis that have been generated from far afield. So maybe from the Japanese earthquake or anywhere else on that ring of fire that might be approaching the coast. And that is it.
So that'll go well. I'm going to just see if I can get rid of this one and say we've got some questions, hopefully from the people who are here. And I need to go here and go back to gallery view. So in case there's some questions coming up from the audience as
All
well.
right.
I need to turn this thing back on. But I'm going to lead off with the first question, which is, you've got this marvelous network going on. You've got all this software that you've been developing. And the key element I saw going through were the episodic support that you got from government. And that seems to be a major issue with a lot of these kinds of things. How confident are you that you will have ongoing funding, or have you been given any assurance of ongoing funding to help with the program that you have now and continuing to develop it as well as make use of the data?
Great question. So typically ONC, we receive our funding through the federal government, through the Canada Foundation for Innovation, as well as other departments like DFO. And that's been something that we've had to renew every 2 or 3 years. But for the first time ever, we now have funding that extends out to 2030. So through our CFI funding, we have a longer window, if you will, for the operation of these systems, which is quite encouraging. The other part of that is, so Natural Resources Canada is developing a Canadian-wide earthquake system as well. So we'll be feeding our system into their eventual one. And when everything gets operational, I think that, yes, the funding will be secured and we'll be able to continue the operation of it. So the majority of the funding to date has been for the development and the proving of the system. But now that we're in operations, or on the cusp of it, I should say, and we have this longer funding window, I think we're in pretty good shape.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
It's great that we have all these sensors and that but in watching your presentation, it looks like it's a reactive versus a proactive tool. So if the seas rise 3 feet like people are predicting, and we have an earthquake, and it depends on where the earthquake is. But if it's outside Victoria or close to the Delta on the mainland, and they have an earthquake, yeah, you'll know about it, but there won't be enough time to get people out.
Yeah, it's absolutely, it's true. There's currently no way to predict the earthquake, so it will always be reactive. The best we're going to be able to do is to detect an earthquake when it happens, and hopefully as quickly as possible, which is why we've established our sensors as close to the likely sources as possible to maximize that warning time.
Right.
But it will always be in a reactive posture.
I think it's great. It's way better than having nothing.
Right. Yeah, the actual earthquake prediction is kind of the holy grail of the science, and there is a lot of activity trying to, understand, earthquakes to the detail that they might be able to predict it, but we're just not there yet.
Because these earthquakes are fairly deep, aren't they?
They can be very shallow too. So it can depend. We've seen some as shallow as 5 or 10 kilometers, and other ones are significantly
Has
deep.
ever come up and suggested drilling holes on the plates to go deeper into the plate to?
Not that I'm aware of. We do have, interestingly enough, we have a borehole on our property out by Pat Bay, where the Lawrence Livermore organization down in the US came up and drilled a borehole and put detection instruments down there. And it was specifically to look at, these micro seismic activity to help them understand whether there were patterns that happened before a larger earthquake. So there is a lot of work, like I was saying, that's undergoing for those
Right.
Yeah, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
We'll go Lynn first and then
Well,
after
I was
Lynn.
just gonna say, is there more increased activity now than there has been? Are you seeing more evidence of earthquakes increasing now?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I'm not a seismologist at all, but I have not heard of any sort of increased. It's, there's seismic activity going on all the time. We're just not aware of it. If you look at some of these websites managed by NRCan and the Earthquakes Canada, et cetera, it's really interesting to see the number of earthquakes that are actually happening on a near daily basis. So
as opposed to Iceland, which has 1,000 per day, and they're expecting a
Yeah.
volcano.
Right.
Elaine,
I'd just like to suggest that you give this presentation to to real estate boards, because when we were looking to move to Vancouver 20 years ago, when we looked in Port Alberni, when we looked in Cassis, when we looked in Kitimat, like moving from Alberta to the ocean, that was part of the discussion from real estate agents.
Okay,
And we did end up buying a house in Kitimat up on the hill.
right.
And yeah, we didn't end up moving to Kitimat, so it's now a rental house, but yeah, it was a major thing that they talked about, like in Port Alberni, where the when the tsunami happened there. And so if you want to buy a house, you should buy one above where the waters were when it was a high tide day when the tsunami came in,
Right.
or night, and
Right.
which made it all much more water than there might have been up into the community.
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
might
those
mention the
areas.
website, the tsunami website that's also available, where you can look at what the predicted wave height is in different locations around.
So there's multiple, and actually, we've actually just applied for additional funding from the government to actually amalgamate all the different tsunami studies and information out there into one easily accessible portal. But right now, the CRD for Victoria has posted on one of their sites the recent tsunami inundation modeling that they did about 2 or 3 years ago. I was mentioning the Strathcona Regional District, so that was all the communities basically from the mid to the north coast that we did is up on their site. They have all their maps and simulations as well. Haida Gwaii and other areas been modeled really well, and also the Prince Rupert area. So we have an outreach team working with the communities. There's a lot of provincial and federal funding that's available to help communities understand the impacts from some of these scenarios and to build some resilience. So hopefully we'll be able to model the remainders as well as come up with a sort of cohesive portal where everybody can access them all one place.
Okay. Nothing in from online. I'm just
Okay.
gonna suggest that first of all, thank you very much, Board, for that delightful overview and some of the information, which may be a little depressing at times, but nevertheless, I think it's better to have information than to not have it. So it really is appreciated for all that enlightening information you've got. Thanks as well to Lydia Folks from BCAA, who provided the coffee for today, and to Frances Matheson from the Esquimalt Pavilion. She is the pavilion supervisor and has helped us set up for the meeting today. And then to Brenda and Lynn for helping set up for the presentation that we've got, and for all their support for CARP as well. The session has been recorded. It should take roughly about a week before we can put it out online. And keep an eye on the Facebook page and our newsletter. You'll see the details about that one. And also our next meeting, which presumably be in February. I haven't got the date fixed yet, but we'll have another meeting coming up then. So keep an eye on the Facebook page. That's facebook.com/CARP Vancouver Island. And with that, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you very much for coming. And thank you again, Gordon.